Intel's i9-9900KS launches today, a binned CPU that should allow for better frequencies at a given voltage. The CPU is best known for its marketing-heavy 5 GHz claims, something that will reopen the can of worms relating to MCE, TDP, and what really counts as 5 GHz. Intel has also dropped some of its prices recently, slotting the 9900KS into the spot where the 9900K previously sat. It then brought its top-tier CPUs down a few bucks as well. The end result is a sort of, kind of new-ish product that claims higher clocks and will exist alongside the 9900K, mostly because it is a 9900K, but it's a bit faster out of the box. Critically, the KS has binned silicon that should mostly guarantee higher clocks at a lower given voltage or vice versa. We'll look into that today, as long as whether 5 GHz really holds at TDP and some benchmarks for power and gaming and production workloads. Before that, this video is brought to you by the Be Quiet Dark Rock Slim, keeping a high performance focus but reducing the footprints to accommodate full memory slot compatibility. The Dark Rock Slim comes with one of Be Quiet's Silent Winds 3 120mm fans, built for low noise operation. The Dark Rock Slim advertises cooling capability up to 180 watt TDP, but mixes in a matte blackout color design to combine performance and looks. Learn more at the link in the description below. The three most important bullet points first. The 9900KS should be $513-ish or so. The 9900K non-S that has existed for about a year now, or a little more actually, should come down to about $485, and it still has the IGP. It can be overclocked to kind of match a KS, but it's not as good. And the 9900KF without the IGP should be $470, and that's the second time in 48 hours I've had to reference notes because of silly naming schemes. So first off, this discussion restarts an important point about TDP and MCE, or multi-core enhancement, which is what motherboard makers use to refer to their version of removing things like power limitations and pulling in more power, requiring more cooling as a result, to give you better performance out of the box. Intel's definition of TDP is a little bit closer to one-to-one with power if it's followed, but it still has some massive asterisks beside it. Should probably be careful with the phrase massive asterisks. It's kind of like big buttons, where some massive asterisk on the internet is going to crop it out and use it out of context. So we'll move on as quickly as possible. Officially, Intel's power limit 1 is 127 watts, which you'll notice is directly related to the TDP, 127 watts for the CPU. So like previous Intel CPUs, what this really means is that the power budget recommended to motherboard manufacturers as the limitation for PL1 is 127 watts. They don't have to follow these guidelines. We consider it basically a spec, but it's not a formal requirement to follow that spec or guidance. So a limited duration turbo is allowed to exist. They can even extend this to infinity, so it's not limited duration anymore, and that provides a greater power budget for higher clocks, exiting the 127 watt PL1. In the instance of the 9900KS, the formal guidance from Intel is a 28 second PL2, which defaults to 1.25 times PL1, or 1.25 times 127, equals 159-ish watts for default PL2. It's under PL2 that the 9900KS will boost to 5 GHz all-core upon PL2 expiry, or again, 28 seconds on boards that play by the guidelines, like the Asus Maximus 11 Hero we used to test. The CPU will drop down to its 127 watt PL1 limiter and will clock accordingly. In all-core applications like Blender, this might be something like a range of 4.4 to 4.6 GHz, and we do have a chart on the screen if you're tabbed away to help see that. It's not 5.0 GHz, so it will drop as PL1 is enforced along with the turbo limits, the duration limits. On a board like the Gigabyte Z390 Extreme, an overclocking focused board with all power limits functionally disabled, the CPU will stick to 5.0 GHz all-core at the cost of significantly increased power. The Gigabyte Z390 Extreme sits at an EPS 12-volt power consumption that's measured at the cables before VRM efficiency losses, but after the wall, so we're more accurate here. That power consumption is about 196 to 203 watts on the Gigabyte Z390 Extreme, sustained, or about 16 amps EPS 12-volt power. That's not 127, clearly. It's quite a bit different. The Asus board, meanwhile, will start at about 15 amps, maybe 15.5 or 186 watts, and fall to 127 watts within 30 seconds, following the Intel guidance with MCE disabled almost precisely, if not precisely. You could bypass this just like is done on the Gigabyte board, but it's done with a few prompts. So at this junction then, it is not possible to both achieve 5.0 gigahertz all-core and achieve a 127 watt power consumption for the CPU. Acknowledging that TDP is not literally power consumption, yes, but Intel's is pretty close, typically, once you get past the initial turbo limits and you enter steady state with turbo durations enforced. It is mostly 1-to-1 in this scenario. It's either 5 gigahertz or it's 127 watts. And which is true will depend on the motherboard, not on Intel. So Intel is not creating this behavior. They provide a guideline the motherboards execute. Asus gets credit for following Intel guidance and sticking to the 127 watt number and 28 second number. Gigabyte gets credit for sticking to what's been marketed, 5 gigahertz, and following what consumers are expecting out of their product. Who's right and who's wrong? It's arguable. Intel probably should look into firmer guidance in the future because of this discrepancy and because of confusion that it creates in the market. Otherwise, we're going to have to address this for eternity. So anyway, let's move on. All of our testing. In this instance, that's a 127 watt number with PL2 turbo duration limits enforced. We considered exiting PL2 to be a violation of the spec for stock testing. And as long as the consumer is made aware of what's happening, it's fine to exit the power limit guidance. But for purposes of cooler and motherboard selection, the power does play a role, obviously, the power level. And we do prefer to see boards that stick to MCE equivalents off and power targets enforced. Overclocking boards, a little bit more leeway there, but we're going to show Blender first. This is more of a gaming CPU, so it makes more sense to show gaming first because it'll do better there comparatively. But we're showing Blender, and that's because it'll allow us to better illustrate the difference of MCE on and off between the two boards we talked about earlier. So with the GN Monkey head stress test, the 9900K stock CPU completed the render in 20 minutes, decreased by 8.9% with the KS stock CPU to 18.5 minutes. The 9900K and KS at 5.1 both hit about 17 minutes, with the 9900K at 5.2 gigahertz at 16.7 minutes. That said, running with Gigabyte and allowing the power to run amok without restriction, the KS improved to 17.3 minutes for the Monkey Head render, a drop of 6.5% versus the Asus board where MCE was off and power limits were enforced. The 3900X outpaces both thanks to its higher core count, which is just the nature of tile-based renderers like Blender. Frequency matters a bit, but threads count the most here, and the extra 4 cores pushes the 3900X to 12.8 minutes. The GN logo render is a bit more abusive. In this render, the 900K stock CPU manages render completion in 26 minutes, with a stock KS at 23.8 minutes. The time reduction is about 9% from K to KS stock to stock, similar in scaling to the previous result. Overclocking the CPUs puts them at around 21 minutes, with the 3900X at about 16 minutes. For the Gigabyte results, the CPU ended up finishing in 21.8 minutes when unrestrained by silly things like Intel, TDP, and recommended power levels. And so it finishes 8.4% faster than the Asus board with MCE off. And that's not to say either's better, it's just to show, hey, if someone tests or benchmarks this product with MCE on versus off, there will be a difference in performance results, and you can see that here. We plan to put the 9900KS or one of them under liquid nitrogen soon, so make sure you check back for that. We have a delivery of liquid nitrogen coming in actually when this video goes up. And we have some basics to discuss here though for normal people use. So a Kraken X62 280mm CLC is our standard liquid cooler for CPU testing, and we choose this because it's something that's achievable, it's normal, and we could get more overclocking headroom out of the KS if we upgraded the cooler to something like, say, a 360 with really loud fans. But that's no longer really that realistic, so we'll save that for later. So it's also kind of cheating because we use the 280 for the 9900K and everything else anyway. So unfortunately, the Asus Maximus 11 Hero that we use had issues with vCore on this one. We were unable to really control it in a way that followed what we were typing in. It's very frustrating. So we tried things like different boot voltages for vCore. We set vCore itself. We tried offsets and adaptive configurations, all kinds of things. It didn't really play along. So working with those parameters of maybe a buggy BIOS, we ended up settling on 5.2 gigahertz at what it provided us, which was 1.323 volts. That was the max we could get out of that board for today anyway. with a 48X on-core. This is a good voltage and a good frequency combo, but we had limited control. So we took it over to an EVGA Z390 Dark, which had a lot of its own problems, mind you, and lacked some of the BIOS options we really like on the Maximus. But we took it over there. We were able to get 5.4 gigahertz with an AVX offset of 2, so we couldn't hold beyond 5.2 for something like Blender. It was pegged at 9598C. And because the Dark lacked some of the options for temperature tuning, that was a limitation that we ran into. So 5.2 was the max we could reasonably hold with this cooling solution for AVX workloads like Blender. For non-AVX games, we could kind of do 5.4, but it was not stable to the extent that we did encounter a couple voltage drops every now and then that would introduce instability or skew the results in a negative fashion to be worse than stock, things of that nature. So unfortunately, we did end up settling for 5.2. 5.3 didn't quite hold. We need a better cooling solution for that as well. So, and we have them, but it's not within the scope of what we're trying to do. So we settled at 5.2. That's the end of it. 1.323 volts, pretty damn good, but we'll have to do more with liquid nitrogen later. And that's what our benchmarks will be with. 5.1 for the 9900K won't be in all of the tests at this point. It needs to be rerun in some of them. We have it in a couple, but it frankly doesn't matter because a 9900K at X frequency should equate a 9900KS at X frequency as well. It's the same CPU after all. Let's get into some of the testing, finally. Power consumption is up now. For power consumption benchmarks, we test at the EPS 12 volt rail to get a relatively accurate pre-VRM power measurement. This is more accurate than power draw at the wall as it isolates the CPU before VRM efficiency losses, and we don't have to worry about all the other overhead from the rest of the system components. We're pretty close to true CPU power draw here. Starting with Blender, the Intel i9-9900KS CPU at stock ended up at 126 watts after the turbo duration expired. Despite running at a fixed 5.0 gigahertz all-core, the 9900KS still follows the Intel turbo window power policies and other Intel power policies when MCE is off. Before the turbo window expires, the 9900KS was drawing about 186 watts on the same workload, but this is only for the first 20 seconds or so. After that, the power consumption falls to 126 watts. This is still higher than the original 9900K, to no one's surprise, and actually does follow the TDP metric pretty closely as a one-to-one. We just published a massive deep dive on what TDP is for AMD and how it works, and how it isn't related to power consumption directly on AMD, so check that out for more information on TDP. Intel's TDP measurements, though, are different from how AMD's work, and in this instance tend to follow the actual power consumption more closely as long as the motherboard follows the Intel power policies, and as long as you're measuring the power after any turbo duration windows expire. Intel notes a TDP of 127 watts, so we're right on top of that after the turbo window. This wouldn't be true with MCE on, as that put us in the 186 watt scenario. Similarly, the 9900K non-S model sits at 91 watts when following the Intel spec limits, so it too is at about the original TDP. The power consumption increase here is for the frequency increase, which can sometimes also require additional voltage for stability. In this case, though, we're working with a specially binned chip, that's the entire KS line, so the required voltage at a given frequency should be lower on the whole. It's just that the frequency is higher too. And finally, note that these are all taken on the same motherboard, so that matters where some boards will push higher auto voltage than others, but we use the same one for this. For comparison, the R9 3900X in this test sits at 148 watts stock or 170 when at 4.3 gigahertz all-core. The 9900K pulls 268 watts when overclocked at 1.41 volts, but the KS can manage this same frequency at a lot less voltage. In fact, our 9900KS was doing 5.2 gigahertz with zero AVX offset, so straight 5.2 at 1.323 V core. The end result was 246 watts for 5.2 gigahertz, as opposed to our previous 1.41 volts 5.1 gigahertz configuration at 268 watts on the non-S SKU. That's a big improvement and voltage requirement reduction from the binning alone. If you're curious about the inverse look at this, single-threaded power consumption, we have a more slimmed down chart for that. We only added this one for the AMD Ryzen 3000 series, so we have a lot fewer CPUs on the chart. Only the 9900K original and the 9900KS are from Intel here, as the rest haven't been rerun through Cinebench R20 just yet. The Cinebench 1T results position the 9900K at 28.8 watts originally, or 30 watts with the 9900KS. There's no meaningful difference here, but that's also somewhat expected. Remember, the 9900K could still turbo up to 5 gigahertz, and with 1T loads, That's a common occurrence. The 9900KS is special for, again, that lower voltage requirement, but primarily because it's configured to hold 5.0 out of the box. These results, then, are pretty predictable. Power consumption for Cinebench R20 NT is up next for another multi-core look. In this one, again with the limited amount of parts on the table, the 9900KS stock CPU strikes 182 watts during the short workload. The 9900K non-S is at 146 watts. Both of these results are higher because the CPUs are completing the test before the duration expiry. So unless running this test back-to-back in rapid succession, the result will be more of the fully boosted power consumption metric. Blender shows lower figures because it's a longer test and we wait to see what the steady state power consumption is. That's the real difference between this Cinebench test and Blender. In this test, the 9900KS at 5.2 GHz and 1.323 volts draws 234 watts, which is actually pretty good for a 5.2 GHz clock thanks to those lower voltages. The 3900X at 4.3 GHz is running 173 watts, with the stock 3900X at 148 watts and close to the stock 9900K original CPU. We're going to pull up one last older chart. This one doesn't have the modern AMD parts on it, but it has older Intel and previous gen AMD parts that can be worth looking at. This gives a representation of a CPU-heavy workload in a gaming environment. Using heavy physics simulation as the load generator, we're able to see what the CPUs look like when they're doing something other than tile-based rendering. In this scenario, the 9900KS is pulling 144 watts when stock, the 9900K is at 127 watts when stock, and the 9900K with a 5.1 GHz 1.41 volt OC is at 210 watts. The 9900KS can hold a 100 MHz higher frequency at 1.323 volts, a big drop in voltage requirement, for a 180 watt power reading. That's a reduction in power consumption of 14% versus the technically slightly slower 5.1 GHz 9900K original sample, and it speaks to how much intentional binning can help with power consumption and with voltage. Moving on to some gaming benchmarks next. Civilization 6 will start us out. For this one, we're looking at average AI player turn time rather than the usual FPS metric. Each second increase in turn time becomes palpable as player count increases, so this can become significant as campaigns drone on and the game gets more complex. For this one, the 9900KS stock CPU managed a 29.1 second average turn completion time, which has it right around the 9700K at 5.1 GHz, with the 9900K stock CPU, not the S, not far behind at 29.7 seconds. Keep in mind two things. One, tests are imperfect and have some variance, but Civ is really consistent and we've controlled it as best we can. Two, and more importantly, Civilization 6 really likes frequency. This is most evident when looking at the sets of results just mentioned, where the 9900K stock CPU can leverage its limited thread boosting frequencies to climb the charts since the cores aren't as heavily and constantly loaded. Overclocking the KS to 5.2 GHz landed it at 28.5 seconds for average turn completion time, a turn time reduction from the stock KS of 2%. The stock 9900K at 5.1 GHz was holding 29 seconds average, sitting right behind the 5.2 GHz 9900KS. GTA 5 at 1080p is up now. At 1080p, the Intel i9-9900K stock CPU originally landed at 122 FPS average, with lows at about 88 and 75. The stock 9900KS configuration improved about 6.6% over baseline at 131 FPS average from 122. The 9900K non-S at 5.1 GHz, our previous stable OC at 1.4 volts, managed 132 FPS average. Lows between the two are functionally identical and are within error for lows, which is a wider error. The 9900KS at 5.2 GHz hit 135 FPS average, a boost of 2.7% over the 5.1 GHz result. For reference, the R9 3900X stock CPU runs at 110 FPS average, allowing the 9900KS stock CPU a lead of 19% over the R9 3900X when both are stock. The 3900X at 4.3 GHz all-core with SMT on hit 113 FPS average, but that doesn't move the needle much when we're comparing overclock versus overclock numbers. Disabling SMT and screwing around with things like that helps, but we don't recommend actually disabling SMT because then you're throwing away half of what you bought the CPU for, so it's just a technology demonstration, not something we recommend. For GTA 5 at 1440p, the 9900KS maintains its positioning and the hierarchy remains largely unchanged. The KS ends up at 132 FPS average when overclocked to the cooler's limits, that's our limitation here, or 129 FPS average when stock. The R9-9900X remains around 108 FPS average, keeping about the same distance as before. As for the 9900K stock CPU, non-S, it's at 122 FPS average, the same as 1080p, and that's because it's CPU limited here, not GPU limited. So this illustrates that even at a high resolution, until you really start pushing something like 4K, the CPU can play a role in performance. The KS is about 6.3% better stock to stock, although overclocking both equalizes them, albeit with a higher voltage for the non-S CPU. The campaign benchmark for Total War Warhammer 2 had the 9900KS at 189 FPS average stock, the highest result for any stock CPU currently on this chart. The overclocked 9900K did slightly better with 5.1 GHz across all cores versus 5.0 for the stock 9900KS. That's with the uncore set to 45. That was at 191 FPS average to 189, while the 5.2 9900KS predictably did best at 196 FPS average. It's impressive, but this is also a test that doesn't care much for extra cores. The 8-core, 8-thread 9700K averaged at 179 FPS without any overclock at all, and it's a great deal cheaper. AMD's highest score on the chart is the 3900X with a 4.4 GHz overclock and SMT disabled, not a configuration we recommend, but a good test, and that brought it to 171 FPS average. F1 2018 gives us a DX11 title to look at, but we'll move back to DX12 next. For this one, the 9900K and KS have finally found our GPU bottleneck at the top end. The 9900KS at 5.2 GHz and 9900KS stock were both stuck at 320 FPS average, which happens to be where the 2080 Ti can no longer keep up with the CPUs. This is all at 1080p, mind you, so it'll only get more GPU bound as the resolution goes up. We can't really draw firm conclusions here since a limit imposes a barrier that cuts off the total gains possible from the CPU upgrade, but the 9900KS manages to outstrip the 9900K stock CPU by a few FPS. We just don't have enough test resolution or headroom here to define the absolute gains. The R9-3900X, for reference, runs at about 276 FPS average stock, and that's plenty, clearly. That's a lot of frames. But if you're more interested in relative scaling, it's about a 16% jump to the GPU-bound 9900KS. The next chart demonstrates a hard GPU bottleneck. If you're curious in this instance, if you're playing at higher resolutions, the GPU fast becomes a limiter that can act as a great equalizer for higher-end CPUs. The 9600K, 700K, 900K, 900KS, can't mix those up, are all functionally equal in this chart. The differences you're seeing, those plus or minus 3 FPS swings, are not actual determiners of performance, but rather normal test variance from bouncing off of a GPU limit and averaging a more random set of numbers because we're limited by another device. The 3900X gets closer in instances of GPU limitations at the top end, naturally, and closes at 230 FPS average. It's still behind at 1440p, though moving up in resolution further might begin to lock the two titans more into step. Hitman 2 is up next, tested in DX12 and first at 1080p. The 9900KS stock runs at 142 FPS average out of the box, with lows at 77 and 47, 1% and 0.1% lows respectively. This puts the KS at 4% over the K stock CPU with hyperthreading on. Overclocking the KS puts it to 144 FPS average, about a 5% gain for the increase in all-core frequency and uncore, although the latter does last for frame rate. The 9900K hyperthreading hyperthreading disabled result helps demonstrate that we still have headroom before hitting GPU limitations. As for the R9-3900X, the stock result runs at 121 FPS average, allowing the 9900KS a lead of about 17.6% over the R9-3900X on this workload. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is next, another DX12 title that's fairly decent for testing, and it's new. The 900KS stock CPU ended up at 172 FPS average, a lead of about 1% over the 9900K stock CPU in this chart. The KS at 5.2 did little for performance, a mixture of nearing GPU limiters and diminishing returns on CPU clocking in this title, so it's a bit of both. Let's throw Adobe Premiere in here too. Adobe Premiere will give us another look at a production workload accompanying our earlier Blender result. For this one, the R9-3900X is back in the driver's seat, leading the pack in a 1080p show floor render with a 3.4 minute render time requirement to get the job done. The 9900K stock CPU required 3.8 minutes, allowing the 3900X an advantage of 10.5%. The 9900KS with the Asus board doesn't really improve much, moving to 3.7 minutes required. If you did this with the Gigabyte board or enabled MCE, then yeah, it'd be faster, but that's cheating. That's not running stock. Overclocking to 5.1 GHz helps a bit more, but it's still not in the lead. In this instance, the 3900X is holding its own. For 4K render results, it's more or less the same, but the scale stretches a bit. The difference is the 1950X sort of claws its way into the results and displaces the 9900K by another rank. The 9900KS ends up at 11.15 minutes for this render, with the 9900K at 11.9 minutes. We're gonna cap it there. We do technically have a whole lot more production and synthetic results, but frankly, you should just look at one of our reviews with the 9900K in it, because it's basically that when we overclock it. And there's no point in adding 15 more minutes to the charts to say that. Also, it is presently 4 hours away from embargo lift, and I need to edit and upload this in time to hit embargo lift. So we're gonna cap it there. We're planning to revisit this chip with liquid nitrogen overclocking just for some fun, see how it scales. It should be better than our 9900K in theory. It's binned. And then as for whether you should buy this, first of all, let's address something. The 9900K is objectively a good processor. The R9 3900X is objectively a good processor. Where they're good depends a bit on which one you're talking about. The 9900K and the KS, because it's the same thing, are good in gaming. They are topping the charts. You cannot presently get faster than those based on our charts. HEDT CPUs don't really add value here. In fact, a lot of them will drag down the performance. If you go to a 9980XE and probably a 10980XE, you're very likely going to end up in a lot of games with less performance than a higher frequency, lower core count, 8-core 9900K. So, the 9900K and the KS are at the top of the charts for gaming, and that's really all there is to that. That doesn't mean the 3900X is bad or that you shouldn't buy it. The 3900X is at the top of the charts for things like Blender. It is also impressively good in Adobe Premiere. And that's frankly not something we really expected out of this generation from AMD. AMD didn't even expect to get the frequencies it got out of Zen 2. So that was pretty cool to see. The way it breaks down then is the same as before. Nothing's really changed. It's just a bit faster now. If you're buying a gaming-only, building a gaming-only computer, and you really, really care about high frame rate, and you're using the highest end possible GPU, and you don't really care about things like Blender rendering with cycles on a CPU. It's a common use case, but it's not that common. Or you don't care that much about Premiere. Or maybe you care a little bit about Premiere, but you care more about gaming. And the 9900K still does well in Premiere anyway, so you weigh them and gaming comes out ahead. Whatever the case may be, the 9900K has those use cases in mind. The 3900X is a better choice if you have $500 to spend, and that's what you're planning to spend for something like Blender, for tile-based rendering, for V-Ray, for decompression with 7-zip. If those things sound appealing to you, you should buy a 3900X. And if gaming at super high frame rates isn't that important, maybe you play games sometimes, but you don't care if it's 16, 17%, well, stat math's funny, but if a 9900K is 16 or 17% ahead of a 3900X, if that doesn't matter to you, then 3900X is fine. So you have two very well-defined options here. This is not us being wishy-washy. This is not us waffling between them. We've given you two very firm recommendations depending on what your workload is. And now it's up to you to figure that part out and choose based on that. Also, as a reminder, there are a lot of very good CPUs that aren't $500 and are cheaper, and you don't have to come up this high in price to get something that's good for gaming or for production. See also R5 3600 and, well, for just about everything really, or i9-9900K for gaming. So that should wrap us up. KS is a K just with its binned, and you'll get better frequency voltage curves, VF curves out of it. I'm just repeating myself at this point. If you jumped here and you want a TLDR, then go away, go back to the beginning and watch the whole thing. I'm not going to recap it any further than that. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to support us directly, like by buying one of our mod mats. The large ones are in stock and shipping now. We just received the most recent batch, so they're no longer on back order. Thank you for your patience. And you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus if you'd like to support us there as well. I have a lot to edit. I'll see you all next time.